That's fun. Okay. Good morning and welcome back. So toward the end of Monday's class, I asked you to work in a partnership or group of three on a worksheet that goes over some different parts of communication through writing. What I'd like you to do is return to those partnerships or groups of three, have that person pull that sheet of paper back up, and I'll give you some time to talk about that. If there's anybody who does not have that paper with them, or anybody who is gone on Monday, raise your hand. I can get that to you. Or anybody else who needs this? Okay. So take some time to wrap up working on this. Yeah. Let's find a time so that we can chat and get you all caught up. Sure. Bryson. Yeah. So I had we spent some time last class doing a writing activity, and just so you know, you don't have to work through this today, but this was the worksheet just so that you have it.
So do you want me to do this just by myself, or
if there are parts that you're comfortable doing or you want to work through, you can, but some of those things are things we talked about last class, which you might not be as familiar with. So we'll talk about that worksheet together then. Yeah.
it's already written, so I think
where you show where you got it. So citation or the quote.
Oh, hey, what's up?
Where
You know, we want to get some about it, right?
So we only use the word wetlands for like the entire.
Yes. So, if you're not referencing or citing a part of that big quotation, then you probably don't need it.
It is argued that again, you got to turn it around. Yeah. Like the has been argued that, you know. Yeah. You could say in this essay, I think you like it online. Significantly increased as related. Yes. In this essay.
Give people just another minute or two. Sounds like most groups are about them. Are any groups who would like some more time?
Yeah.
All right. So let's take some time to talk about this together, right? This is not outside of attendance, not something that I'm grading. So if you didn't feel great in your response to a question, that's what this class is for, right? To talk about and workshop this together. So let's talk about these. First of all, what citation style is this? How many folks believe it's MLA, Chicago, APA? Yes. So this is APA, right? And you know, for a few different reasons, it is last name of the author, it is year, and then if it's a quotation, right, it's a page number. There's also a comma in between, right? So if you were doing MLA, there would be no comma, and you would just be doing the page number, right, rather than the year. So yes, this is APA style, which is one of the 3 you can use in this class. Communication audiences can be divided into a pyramid, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and mediated. How many folks believe this should include a citation? Any folks think that it shouldn't? Okay, so I do think that this is a good idea to include a citation in a lot of situations, right? The reason for that is because the pyramid, right, is not something that you came up with, nor is it something that we would necessarily consider to be in common knowledge, right? So I think that this is a good case in which including a citation, since you're paraphrasing something from the book, could be included, right? So again, if you're paraphrasing or you're drawing from material from your textbook, even if you're saying it in your own words, a lot of times it's a good idea to include that citation, right? I think that if you didn't in this case, right, it wouldn't be blatant plagiarism or anything like that, but you just want to be careful that if you are referencing an idea that's not yours, that's coming from something like your book, that you're including a reference to that, even if it's not a direct quotation. So again, I wanted to include that question just to highlight an example of a situation where it's good to cite, even if it doesn't feel like it's as absolutely necessary. According to Johnson, we should act without delay. Should this include a citation? How many people say yes? Yes, so it should, right? And the reason for that in particular is because there is a quote. So one way that you could easily do this would be to say, according to Johnson, right, we must act without delay, and then maybe it's page 86, right? Or, right, if you're using APA, it might be 1998, page 86. You already have the author said in the sentence, so you don't need to include the author again, but in APA, you would need to include the year and the page number. If you were doing just MLA, you could just do the page number like that, right? In my own opinion, more communication should be interpersonal rather than mediated. How many folks think this needs a citation? No. So this does not need a citation. The reason for that is because you're expressing your own opinion, right? Again, if it's your own opinion or it's something that's common or public knowledge, that would not need a citation. In the opinion advanced in this essay, it is argued that media's role in society has significantly increased. So I'd like to hear from a group or two who tried revising this sentence. What did you come up with? Is there anybody who wants to share their fixed up version? This group here in the back corner. So here with, okay. Yeah. Anybody else come up with anything slightly different? Yeah.
So the opinion in this essay argues that media's role in society is significant.
So a couple different options here. Depending on the class, right, the use of first person pronouns might be considered to be okay or acceptable or not, right? It depends on the norms and about what your instructor is looking for. I think first person is great, especially in a class like this one where you're reflecting on your own experiences. It's very difficult not to use first person. So I argue that media's role in society has significantly increased, but it really gives you that thrust. You're making an argument rather than saying in the opinion advanced, which is a lot clunkier, right? So the opinion this essay argues, right? I think it could maybe be a little bit cleaner. You might say, for instance, this essay argues and eliminate the opinion. I don't know that the opinion adds a whole lot there, but I do like this idea. Media's role in society is significantly increasing, making this present rather than past tense, right? I think doing that, using present tense in situations like that just makes your writing a lot easier and more compelling, When is it appropriate to use large block quotations? But here in the front.
You said what, like, the entire quote is relevant to which one is the
Right? So one really good practice to do is to think to yourself, what do I need out of this entire quotation, right? If you're going shopping, right? If you're going shopping for school supplies, you're not going to buy a whole bunch of binders and folders and things that you don't need, right? You're getting the things from the store that you actually are going to use. In the same way, right, when you're quoting from the text, if you're using all of a block quotation, like it's relevant to your argument, great, but don't include a big quotation just for the sake of it, right? The quote doesn't speak for itself. It's your job to help us understand the quote and why that quote is relevant. So you can use it if the entire point is relevant to your argument. Don't use it just to add space to an essay, right? Use it to enhance what you're trying to say and continue to have the voice and perspective on you. So what makes a complete citation? So, right, that depends on the citation format. The two big things that you would need, right, for a formal essay would be in text and works cited or references, right? Complete citations include the little parentheticals. They also include that full citation at the end of the paper. Complete citation, depending on the format, right? Under APA, it would be last name of the author, the year, and then the page number if relevant. MLA would be the last name of the author followed by the page number with no commas. And then Chicago, you would use a footnote or endnote, and then that footnote or endnote indicates the citation. Any questions on any of these? I'm going to continue to have that worksheet available for you to access on Canvas at any point if you want to refer back to that. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pass forward those activities. Again, I'm not grading how well you answered the questions. Just wanted to work through this together as an attendance activity. And if you're finding yourself having questions about any of these or about questions with citations or references later on in the class, you're welcome to let me know. All right. So we spent some time going over writing. Again, I know this is a review for some of you, but I think it's good just to understand some of those tips about doing that. Again, the Writing Center, Tutoring Center, and other resources are really great to use. For today, we're going to be focusing on interpersonal communication, talking to yourself, communicating with yourself, and how that shapes essentially who we are as people, right? We might think that interpersonal communication is a little bit silly, like you're singing a song to yourself, get pumped up for the day, but really you have this voice in your head that's helping you to make decisions. You're thinking about and deliberating every single day. You know, do I get ice cream or am I having a healthy day, right? How am I going to spend this money, knowing that I have to pay for rent? Like those decisions are things that we use communication to try to resolve, right? And how we develop a language for ourselves on how to make decisions and communicate is something that is incredibly important. So another idea here that I think is really crucial is not only the idea that interpersonal communication is how we make decisions, but it's also how we evaluate and figure out who we are and make judgments about who we are as people, right? A lot of us who might suffer from low self-esteem or self-worth, right, are making these evaluations about who we are. I don't think I'm a good person. I don't think I should be here, right? Feelings, for instance, of imposter syndrome are common, where you think you're not actually the person that should be here. You know, somehow you ended up here as an accident. Those things are crucial to our health and our well-being. There are significant impacts that things like mental health can have, and communication plays a really big role in how those things shape our lives. So if they're seeing it, right, then that could be nonverbal, interpersonal. So if they're not seeing it, then I think we probably have it in the interpersonal realm, right? It's a good question, right? So as a reminder, what is intrapersonal communication? Yeah, so intrapersonal communication is communication with yourself. Think back last week to the pyramid, right? Intrapersonal communication is at the tippy top. Interpersonal communication is between two people. Then we get group, mediated, and public, right? So intrapersonal communication happens within yourself or somebody's mind. And think about this as a spectrum, right? On one end of the spectrum, you are just thinking to yourself. So for instance, you might be thinking, oh, what shirt am I going to wear today, right? Or what shirt tie combo am I going to do today, right? That would be an example of one end, talking out loud to yourself, saying, oh, they don't have this at the store today when you're going through Safeway, right? Would be an example of the other end. But we do a lot of things in between. So if you mumble or you mutter to yourself, right, then there's that in-between space in intrapersonal communication. And a lot of times, right, we think about talking to yourself as being kind of weird, right, or silly, but it's something that the majority of people do. And it's something that can be incredibly helpful for making sense cognitively of our needs and how to make those fulfilled. If we think back to this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, starting at the bottom with the physiological needs like food, water, shelter, thinking at the top to things like self-actualization, we use interpersonal communication all the time to fulfill those needs. For example, maybe you're gearing up for a big interview and you're practicing questions to yourself, or you're doing a few tongue twisters for yourself, right? You're fulfilling a safety need because you want that job to secure your well-being, and you're using interpersonal communication to make sure that that gets met, right? So interpersonal communication fulfills a lot of things in our lives. In addition to that, right, interpersonal communication is essentially allowing us to judge and assess ourselves. So if you're doing some practice, right, so maybe you're in track and you're running laps and you don't have the score that you want, or you're not doing as well as you want to, right, you're judging yourself saying, oh, I could have done better. I need to practice more. I need to get in better shape, right? You're essentially diagnosing yourself to figure out a solution. In this way, we use communication to shape our self-esteem. Again, think back last week, the words that you used to describe yourself. A lot of those words were shaped by other people and shape our self-esteem or value. If you see yourself as a kind person, you value that pretty highly and see that as important. That's something that happens through your communication with other people that shapes your self-esteem, the stories that you tell yourself about yourself, and then that comes in and shapes the way that you communicate, like in this class when you were sharing those words that you used. So it's a cycle, right? Our sense of self, our self-esteem is something that's constantly changing over time. As teenagers, right, we deal with a lot of anxiety and uncertainty about who we are, trying to find our place in the world. And we might still find challenges with figuring out our sense of self, our self-esteem, how we fit in college, right? All of those challenging things. So I want to show you a kind of silly example, but I think one that gets at some of these ideas about how we use interpersonal communication to shape our sense of self or our idea, right? So there's a 2015 high school comedy movie called The Deaf, right, that came out. And the acronym, right, is really kind of mean and offensive, right? The acronym stands for Designated Ugly Fat Friend, which of course would be fat shaming and, you know, pretty bad. But we see those types of insults, slurs, comments being made about people all the time. What ends up happening through a lot of things like bullying is the ways that people internalize and use them within their own narratives and their own senses of self. And oftentimes what we experience is a disconnect between how we think we are to other people, how we're coming across to other people, and how other people are actually responding to and making sense of us. And that disconnect can reshape our sense of self and our interpersonal communication. So I wanted to show a trailer from this movie that, again, gets at the way that interpersonal communication might change our sense of identity.
For generations, you could only be a jock, a geek, a princess, or a basket case. I'm my own best friend. But what I didn't know was I had a brand new label.
They're my favorite now.
Sorry, what?
DUFF, designated ugly fat friend.
What did you just say to me?
Look, I didn't mean it like that. Every group of friends has one. You're the one who's approachable. You brought it up. Good for you. You can't take it literally. There are older women that are cougars, so they can be full human.
I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. It was becoming harder and harder to deny the truth. I was like, oh, there were 3 inches. Everything and everyone can touch it. Oh, someone's in a room right now, because I'm so heavy.
Oh, no, you did. I didn't say it. Yes, you did.
I don't want to be anybody's stuff anymore.
Don't you hate me?
Yes, I do. But you're the only one who told me what was actually going on. I will make sure you pass science if you help me with this.
You got the easy part. That's the reverse stuff.
So we'll do it
On one condition. You gotta ask me in the monster voice.
from when we were little.
Mhm.
No, I don't remember it.
Sure.
Yes, I don't, I couldn't.
Right? So I think a lot of times in school, right, we find ourselves typecast and categorized, right? There's the jocks, the nerds, somebody who's their own best friend, that's interpersonal communication, right? But this idea, right, where she hears this label, this term used to describe her, and then she like goes back through her old photos and thinks back about her friendships and like reassesses her relationship to other people. That's this way that interpersonal communication is shaping our self-concept, our values, and so on. She thinks, oh, I'm not this duff, right? I'm not this label. It's used to describe her, and she's changing the way that she thinks about her relationships due to how she thinks about this label and how she feels that this label might define her, or how she might choose to reject it, right? So communication is used to form evaluations of self-worth, right? This incongruence between how you think you are, who you are as a person, your self-interest. I'm a part of this group. I'm a friend that's just as valuable and just as respected, and then coming to realize, oh, maybe I'm not. Maybe my friends and so on don't value me in the way that I wish that I want to be valued, right? That would be an example here of how self-image, self-concept, self-esteem shapes their communication. So when it comes to this idea about self-concept, what we essentially have are 3 different circles, and ideally there is overlap between these 3 different circles, right? In this way, we have what is known as our self-image, our self-worth, and our ideal self. The idea here is that if who we want to be is seen as really, really different than who we actually are right now, those things would be pretty incongruent, right? And as a result of that, we might be feeling sad, upset, disconnected from our ideal self, and that our well-being is less as a result. So according to Carl Rogers, right, in communication, psychology, and human theory, it's important for us to make sure that these elements do overlap with each other, right? We'll be talking about each of those 3 in a little bit more detail. Self-image would refer to generally who you are as a person. Self-worth would be how you value yourself as a person. And ideal self is who you see yourself as wanting to be, right? So if who you are and who you want to be are similar, if you say to yourself, you know, I want to be able to lift 200 pounds, but I can currently lift about 150, I'm getting there, right? Or I'm, you know, closer to my personal goals or who I want to be, then generally speaking, our psychological and social well-being is going to be a bit higher. So self-image refers to this idea of who you are and how you know this about yourself. So if you're thinking about, for instance, a class introduction, a lot of those basic kind of biographical details. So, you know, what year you are in school, things that you like to do in your free time, those are things that are generally pretty stable. And again, are not necessarily about an evaluation. You might say, I'm a pretty tall person, I'm 6'2". And that's a sense of self-image, right? And that can change over time as your interests, your activities, and the way that you present yourselves to people changes, right? For instance, a lot of people under COVID who thought that they were introverts became very socially isolated and realized, hey, I like people more than I thought. I'm less introverted, or even I'm a bit of an extrovert. And my self-image has changed as a result of my experiences. So self-image is these stable ideas of who you are. Self-worth is then about the value that you place onto who you are as a person, right? You might be saying, not only am I a tall person, but I consider myself lucky to be tall. I'm glad that I'm a tall person because when my little sister is asking me to get cereal, all I gotta do is reach out. I don't have to grab a chair or a stool, I can just get it, right? So you might like and value yourself on that basis, right? Considering whether or not you're a good person and so on are also ways that we can consider self-worth. So when we think about worth, right, we oftentimes associate that with like a monetary value, but a value might be the value of something like kindness, something like integrity, something like ethics. How do you see yourself as meeting that particular value or belief that is considered to be important to your culture or group, right? This can also vary a lot depending on culture. Countries like the United States are considered to be more individualistic in how members behave culturally, right? So that means that things such as personal achievement and success are valued more highly. In more collectivist cultures, such as Japan or South Korea, right, there's a higher value placed on your ability to connect with and harmonize with other people, in large part due to having much higher population density. So what we consider to be self-worth, being a good or bad person, right, is definitely going to vary depending on context and situation. If you find yourself not fitting into a group who has different senses of self-worth and value, you could find that to be pretty different too. So for instance, I am the courage I seek, the love I seek, safe from harm, etc. Those might be the stories that you tell yourself about who you are, right? People who like to do things like affirmations, like having little plaques or quotations, oftentimes do so as a way of reminding themselves about their own self-worth. So we use interpersonal communication to remind ourselves how we might be valued as a person, or we might use self-worth and affirmations of self-worth in times where we're feeling particularly anxious or like it's been unsettled. I like the visual here of a pawn, right, that's imagining itself as a queen, right? If any of you play chess, you know that if a pawn makes it to the end of the board successfully, that it can transform into a knight, bishop, a rook, or a queen, right? And that's this idea of an ideal self, right? Typically, an ideal self is attainable in some way. That, you know, you don't say to yourself, oh, you know, I really want to be this famous celebrity or whomever, right? I wish I was as famous as Paul Rudd. That's not going to happen necessarily, but a more attainable goal would be to say something like, I really want to get the lead in the next TOU theater production. So who you want to be and who you wish you were fit in this notion of the ideal self. And again, this idea that there's overlap between those three parts is important because oftentimes if our ideal self feels like something we can reach or get closer to, that our self-worth, our valuation of ourselves increases because we feel like we can meet those goals and improve. But if we see this major gap, if we're setting goals that are really outside of what we see as reasonable for us, or we find ourselves consistently unable to reach those goals, that tends to contribute to this negative self-worth and valuation. So again, these three parts really help us to try to unpack how we understand ourselves as people. To what extent is who we are, how we value ourselves, and see as good or bad, and who we want to be, lining up with itself. And it's never going to completely line up. You might not be completely your ideal self. There might be things to continue to work on and goals to reach, but our interpersonal communication and well-being tends to improve when we have that congruence. Right? And in addition to those parts, we have this idea of self-esteem, right? And self-esteem and self-worth seem pretty similar, But self-esteem is more about a fuller evaluation about yourself as a person, right? So while self-worth might be considering, whether or not you're a good person or how much value you place on yourself, self-esteem is considering sort of the range of things about yourself, what you can do, and so forth. You might have lower self-esteem because you were not picked for the varsity team, right? So as a result of that, your self-esteem could be reduced. A couple important elements here about self-esteem. First of all, it's subjective, right? Because you're making this determination about yourself, it is, of course, going to be biased, right? We are our own worst critics. We tend to be really hard on ourselves if we're not doing things exactly right. I'll give you one example. In grade school, I got a 19 out of 20 on a spelling test, and I'll never forget it. I spelled the word lettuce wrong, and I was so upset that I missed one that I wadded up my test and I threw it in the trash in the most dramatic way possible, right? I never have spelled lettuce incorrectly ever again, but experiences like that tie into this idea of self-esteem. It's not rational. It's not based on an objective evaluation. It's based on how you hold yourself up to a certain standard, right? This idea of evaluation is giving a type of judgment on who you are. And again, self-esteem can oftentimes be used in that negative way, being hard on yourself, being critical of yourself, but it can also be used in a positive way to push you, right? I don't feel particularly great about how I did on this test, but I know that I need to study more and I can do well the next time. Or I feel pretty good about myself. I did this major accomplishment, right? I got all of my readings done by Wednesday, right? Self-esteem can improve in those situations and help us to become more functioning in what we want to achieve. Another idea here, and I think this one's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's still a useful one for us to break down a bit, is the idea of the looking glass. So this term comes from, if you're familiar with Alice in Wonderland, right? One of the books is called Through the Looking Glass. And essentially, whenever we're communicating with other people, there's a part of our brains that is imagining and reflecting on how we must look in that situation, right? A really good way of thinking about this is imagining, okay, if this conversation was recorded and I got to see myself, what would I see? How would I be talking with that other person? What's going on, right? Or say you've got a big stain on your shirt right before you're going out on a date, right? You're going to be really anxious about wiping that up, and you're going to be worried during the date about whether or not that stain shows up. We're imagining how we look to other people pretty regularly. That's this idea of a looking glass self, is imagining how we look to other people. Again, a lot of us really hate seeing ourselves being recorded. I do too. I don't like looking back at the videos from classes, right? Oftentimes, the way that our voice sounds, our mannerisms and behaviors are things we pick up on that go against how we like to be. So the looking glass self is this idea that we imagine and reflect on what our performances might be. We use imagination to think about who we are. We imagine what other people think of us. So for instance, if you have a stain on a shirt during a date, right, you might imagine that people think that you are, not very clean or put together, or that you're a bit absent-minded because you have a stain, right? You're thinking, what do they think of me? Oftentimes, for instance, on first day of class, when you all introduce yourselves, you might have that looking glass self. You might be interested in sharing who you are to other students and ensuring that maybe they like you and can get to know you better, right? And we react to this imagination. In other words, maybe you thought you were tripping over your words or not speaking in the way that you would have liked. We're thinking about, okay, if we look like this to somebody else, what can we do about it? One thing that I find really useful in a class of public speaking is if you do record yourself and you go through that agonizing process of hearing yourself talk and being really frustrated with it, you can start to pick up on verbal tics and things that you do that you don't like that maybe you could use to improve on your communication in the future. So reacting to how you appear to other people and improving that can be a part of the interpersonal communication process. There's another kind of idea that connects pretty closely to this about self-compassion. So one thing the book talks about that I think is kind of funny is this idea of like a vulture, right? There's like a vulture that's circling over you or is on your shoulder. And the idea is that the vulture is just like saying mean things about yourself. I'm not a good person. You know, I can't do this. I'm not going to succeed, right? Those types of negative statements about yourself. If you ever read or watched Winnie the Pooh as a kid, right? The character Eeyore likes to say mean things about himself, right? The kind of internal dialogue that says mean things about yourself, this vulture, is something that you can try to avoid through the practice of self-compassion through interpersonal communication, right? It's the idea that we show sympathy for ourselves in the same way that we show sympathy for other people, right? Again, we're our own worst critics. We can be very hard on ourselves if things don't go perfectly or exactly the way that we want. So the use of self-compassion is to say, hey, sometimes you got to give yourself a break, right? You're a student who is navigating a lot of classes. You're trying to figure everything out. You didn't get the score you wanted on the test, but that's okay. You have a solution to try to work forward, right? So self-compassion is a way that we might reframe our own interpersonal communication to be a little bit more positive. So what I want to do in the remaining 10 minutes is take the time for you to think about some of these elements that you would use to define yourself. So you can type this, or you can do this on a sheet of paper with your name on it. And what I'd like you to do is to take some time to think about some of the words that you use to describe yourself. So you might be thinking about your activities, the value you place on yourself as a person, and so on, right? And as you're doing that, you might think about some additional words that you would use to describe yourself and put yourself more in the 8 to 10 range. And then once you've done that and kind of sorted some of those words to describe yourself into those different circles, you know, take some time to reflect. Do you see these parts overlapping? Do you see parts that are in your ideal self that are not really close to your self-image? What are you noticing? So take some time to think about these words, where you would place those words, and reflect on what you're noticing. give you a couple more minutes, and if you haven't already, you might start to think about where you do and don't see that overlap in these three different parts. So we think a lot about self-esteem, value we place on ourselves, the things that we say about ourselves, right? But communication is how that happens. A lot of you mentioned being interested in this class to kind of improve upon your communication skills. And I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to think about how you talk about yourself or how you think about yourself, right? Oftentimes we don't take a step back to do that. And oftentimes our own well-being or our ability to complete tasks can be improved if we really think about how we use our interpersonal communication to shape our sense of identity. So we spent some time at the beginning of class going over that writing activity. And again, you're welcome to reach out either to me, Writing Center, or other resources to help with writing. I'll continue to have that handout available on Canvas. We spent some time today talking about this idea of interpersonal communication, how it helps us to make decisions and understand who we are. And also lets us make that evaluation of our identities, right? So I'm not going to ask you to share what you worked on for today, since it's pretty personal. But I do think it's helpful to continue to reflect on your own communication. As a reminder, in addition to the second Canvas prompt, which you complete by Friday, there's also the syllabus quiz for Friday as well. So do take some time. It's pretty short. It's open note and open book. It's just on Canvas. So do make sure to complete that syllabus quiz if you haven't already done so by Friday. Next class, we'll be talking about ways that personality and media shape our own communication. So go ahead and either pass forward or email me the prompt that you just worked on. Have a great rest of your morning, and I'll see you again on Friday.